Hello, welcome to another English language A-level video with me, Paul, from the QE here at Darlington. Now, this one is about language diversity, and we're going to start looking at kind of research, like pioneering research about language diversity. We're going to be looking at the work of Basil Bernstein and also going to be looking at the work of William Labov as well. So let's get started. Basil Bernstein. So here's what he looked like. He was British, he was a teacher, he was an influential sociolinguist. He did a lot of teaching in higher and further education. He was principally interested in academic performance and why working class children, despite having the same level of education as middle class, didn't tend to do as well, didn't tend to perform as well in the classroom. So he's principally interested in why that was the case. And his answer lay, he thought, in language. So what he did was he used the terms restricted and elaborated codes to describe the differences between working class and middle class children's spoken language. So restricted codes for working classes, elaborated codes for middle classes. So this is a kind of deficit model, actually quite a prescriptive approach to language, where he's making a kind of value judgment about people's level of language. And basically what he's arguing is that working class children sometimes do badly at school because they have this restricted code at home, which they're used to. And so when they come to educational institutions, the problem is that they have little understanding of that kind of elaborated code that is used by teachers and is assumed that that is the spoken way of doing things. Okay, so if we're thinking about restricted code, this kind of working class language that Basil Bernstein is seeing, then it's deictical, i.e. it tends to be context dependent, I should say. It's likely to share all sorts of common assumptions, i.e. it's going to have a vast amount of meaning in only a few words. So you're going to get a kind of quite a complex set of connotations where you've got implicature, where, you know, meanings are implied rather than being spelled out. Basically, it creates a social message of inclusion, doesn't it? That when you're using restricted code, you as the listener, you're one of us. Okay, so it's often used in family or friendship groups, or even in occupational groups with people who work together. It's a restricted community. I mean, the important thing to remember on this is that everyone has restricted code communication some of the time. Okay, here's what Basil Bernstein says it features in terms of the language. So often it's got quite short, simple, and incomplete sentences. So quite a lot of ellipsis, quite limited vocabulary. So the lexicon is kind of narrow, and often you get fillers, things like, you know. Here's an example. You know what I mean? I said to Mary. What do you mean by that? She said, ask him what's on this one. Oh, does he? I said, well, he better be letting me know what's on his mind or I'll be after him. Pass me that, will you, before I forget it? Doesn't make much meaning to us as outsiders who don't know the situation and don't know to whom, you know, these pronouns refer. You know, pass me that, will you, before I forget it. We don't know what they're talking about. We don't know. These are completely deictical utterances. So Basil Bernstein's point is that that is the kind of language that characterises working class homes, and that therefore children who come from those homes going to schools are at a disadvantage because the expectation is that they ought to be using elaborated code, which is more impersonal, which is context-free, which is less likely to assume shared attitudes. Okay, so it's more depersonalized, it's more neutralized languages because assumptions cannot be made in elaborated code about the listener's knowledge. So you've got complex sentences, you've got the use of subordination, you've got a wider kind of vocabulary, you've got the lack of ellipsis and therefore more kind of standard English forms. Could you let me know your plan for the meeting? Is it cancelled or not? What excuse are you proposing to make? And who do you expect to do your dirty work? It just isn't right to let people down when they've been expecting some answers about company policy. You can see there the extended vocabulary that we've got here. We've got subordination, we've got complex sentences, and we've got everything put here in standard English. Okay, so this is what Basil Bernstein is saying. This is the language of education, which allows the middle classes to get on in life more than the working classes. Okay, now I wonder to what extent, you agree with that, or whether you think, Bernstein is not right, is not applicable to us, in the 21st century. Certainly there was criticism at the time. Famous sociolinguist William Labov, and we're going to find out about his work in a minute, but he disagreed with Bernstein because what he did was he did lots of interviews with black working class New Yorkers on the streets of the city, and he came to the conclusion that working class speech is just as complex, actually, as middle class speech. It's different, but it's just as complex. And, these people were perfectly able to communicate all sorts of nuanced, complicated ideas. He also didn't like the assumptions that Bernstein had made. He didn't like the assumption that the middle classes speak in this kind of elaborated code and that the working classes speak in this restricted code. He felt that those were really big assumptions that they were making. And also he didn't like the fact that there wasn't actually any linguistic evidence that was produced by Bernstein to back it up. Okay, so it was kind of criticised at the time by Labov. The final thing I'd say about the Bernstein thing was that it was incredibly influential because all sorts of projects were set up, kind of language starter projects set up in the States, injecting money into certain communities where it was thought that restricted code was the kind of the norm that was kind of restricting educational progress by working class children. We mentioned there about William Labov. Let's say a little bit more about him, William Labov, because he did two pioneer studies, which I'm going to talk about now. So we're not going to do that. We're going to go to here. Now, let me take you to Martha's Vineyard. So we're on the east coast of the USA. We're about 200 miles northeast of New York, are we? I don't know, something like that. Popular tourist destination for New Yorkers, escaping the sweaty city in the heat of the summer, and they're coming out to Martha's Vineyard. Famous, of course, for Steven Spielberg setting his Jaws film in the late 1970s on Martha's Vineyard. So linguistically, it's an interesting place because you've got your islanders, or your up islanders as they're called, who live there, 100% of the time. And then you've got this transient population that moves there over the summer. So it was interesting for Labov in terms of language and identity, and the way, particularly the impact of the summer visitors, the impact that they had upon the language of the people who lived and worked there all the year round. Okay, so as I said, it's a fairly isolated location, but it's got this popular summer tourist destination. And William Labov was really a pioneer on sociolinguistics because he did it in a kind of systematic and scientific way, where he interviewed 69 participants. He made sure that they were from a diversity of different backgrounds, like different ages and different occupations and different ethnic groups. And he honed in on particular diphthongs, the ow and the I sounds. So he was interested in phonology, the accent features, and it was very, very precise what he was looking at. And what he discovered, well, he discovered lots of things, but he discovered that the local people, particularly aged 31 to 45, and the traditional Up Islanders, i.e. the original island inhabitants, they tended to pronounce their phonemes in similar and distinctive ways. And he particularly found that males aged between 31 and 45, particularly in the summer months when the summer tourists were there, tended to pronounce things in similar ways to your traditional Up Islanders. And so he saw that as evidence of two groups kind of subconsciously trying to establish their identities as vineyarders and therefore distancing themselves from summer tourists. Okay. So really what you've got here is Howard Giles' accommodation theory in practice, this idea of convergence and divergence, that you've got these people who converge together in their language, the Up Islanders and the local people aged 31 to 45, and in so doing, they're diverging from the language of the kind of standard English form of the New York middle classes who are coming there for their holidays. So that's quite a kind of seminal work in terms of language and identity. The other one I want to talk about from William Labov is called the New York Department Store Research. This is an interesting one where William Labov is particularly interested in rhoticity. Now, rhoticity means the R sound. Now, we know that conventionally in American English, particularly middle-class American English, the R sound is foregrounded. So take a word like car, American English car, or heart becomes heart. And so he was interested in the level of rhoticity, and he wanted to see whether the social class that people belonged to actually had an impact on their level of rhoticity. So he did his research in New York City in the 1960s, and he believed that the higher the social class of a speaker, the more frequent the occurrence of this rhotic R form. So he interviewed all sorts of people. His most famous piece of research was in 3 department stores of different social rankings. So you've got Saks, which is the highest social ranking, big posh department store. That's like your Debenhams, for example, or your Bins. So you've got Saks, Fifth Avenue. Then you've got Macy's, which is kind of middle social ranking. And then you've got Klein, which is believed to be kind of lower social ranking, more kind of cheap and cheerful. And so he went round these department stores and did interviews with people. Famously, he interviewed a whole load of shop assistants, asking them where women's coats were, because women's coats were up on the 4th floor, and that's the phrase that he wanted to elicit from them. So he would go up to somebody on the 2nd floor and say, "Excuse me, could you tell me where the women's coats are?" And that might elicit the answer 4th floor. And he would pretend to be a little bit hard of hearing, like he couldn't hear them. He'd say, "Excuse me," and they would have to repeat it. And so what he had there is 2 lots of data. He had kind of casual responses, like the first utterances that these assistants made, but then he had the kind of careful kind of utterances that they did as well. So interesting, isn't it? We mustn't think of people's phonology as being a kind of static thing. It kind of completely depends on the situation and the context that people are in. Okay, now, so here's a graph that shows you what he concluded, because basically he concluded that rhoticity appears to be related to social status, and that actually rhoticity in the 1960s in New York at that time was a useful indicator of social status. So here you've got Saks, which was the big posh store, and you can see as a percentage there, the R's there are, you've got over 90% of the utterances with very heavily foregrounded R. Macy's, much, much less so, less than 50%. And then Klein's, which was your cheap and cheerful place, where only 30% of the utterances had these R's. So that shows a very clear delineation between them. And it also demonstrates the difference between people's casual and careful speech as well, because what it shows is that the middle classes, ever conscious to keep their social respectability, when they're asked to repeat the word, they do it in a more careful way, i.e. a more rhotic way, you see on the Macy's there. And similarly with Klein as well. So there is a difference, Labov finds, between people's careful and casual pronunciation of those words. Okay, so 2 very important studies done by William Labov there, following his criticism of Basil Bernstein's model of language. Okay, so we're going to stop it there, and then in the next video we're going to have a look at a few more pieces of research done a bit closer to home in Britain. Thank you.